everybody, how's it going? Nice to see you again. Thanks for tuning in. So today, let's talk about ISO, International Standards Organization, but also film speed. And film speed and sensor sensitivity is what we're on about. So let's figure out what we're talking about. So it's part of your exposure triangle with ISO, aperture, and shutter speed being the three main adjustments that you make for creative photography. So your shutter speed deals with motion blur and motion sharpness, and your aperture deals with depth of field or what's in focus or what's blurry, like blurry backgrounds. Have your subject in focus and your background blurry, or have your subject in focus and everything else sharp, like in a landscape. Have a big depth of field versus a narrow depth of field. That's your aperture. Well, ISO is what I'm talking about today, and ISO is your film speed and or your sensor sensitivity. And the thing to understand about ISO is your base ISO in your camera is going to give you your cleanest exposures. As you increase your ISO, you're going to increase your noise. So what you need to understand about ISO is your base ISO is going to give you your cleanest images, your images with the least amount of noise in them. As you increase your ISO, you're going to increase your noise. And so optimal image quality will happen at your base ISO in your camera. In my camera, in the Fuji X-T5 and X-H2, the base ISO is 125. There are lower settings, but they'll use, on my camera it says low, like 64. That's not the base. The base is the lowest number that's just a number, right? So it's different for every camera, but usually it's the slowest speed that's native to the camera. Okay, so now we've defined what it is. So the rule of thumb for ISO is to shoot at the lowest, is to shoot at the base ISO all the time. That's the rule of thumb, to give you optimal image quality. But there are times when increasing your ISO won't be detrimental to the photograph, but it will allow you to get the photograph. A great example of that is I was traveling back to Portland from Eastern Oregon when I was first moving out here. I was making a bunch of trips, moving all my stuff. And I was coming back into Portland, and it was right around sunset, and I'm driving on I-84, and I'm just coming out of the Columbia River Gorge, and there had been thunderstorms in the area. And I was looking over my shoulder, and not only were the clouds starting to light up orange in the Columbia River Gorge, but there was also a full rainbow that was happening. And right there was the turnoff for a place where I knew I could get the shot. But I knew, like, the shot was happening right now. And I didn't have time to set up a tripod or screw around. I grabbed my camera, I grabbed my wide lens, I ran out to where the shot was, and I shot this shot at ISO, I think it was 800. And handheld like f8, but I got the shot. And the shot is fine, and the shot has sold a bunch. I've made a lot of money off of this photograph. So there's an example where upping the ISO allowed me to get the shot. Now, ideally, I would have been in position with a tripod, and I could have shot it at base ISO, and it would have been better, but I still got the shot. So I broke the rule of thumb and got the shot, and that's what this is about. So one of the things you need to do with your camera is figure out what's the most amount of noise you can tolerate. What's your noise curve look like in your camera? Take a bunch of photographs at like 400, 800, 1200, 1600, 3200, 6400, and see, like, get a feel for, you know, at these settings, this is the kind of noise I'm gonna get. Another way to think of ISO is in terms of like a stereo or an amplifier for a guitar. It's your volume knob, right? And the higher you turn your volume, the more it starts to break up. Now with an electric guitar, that could be a good thing. That's called distortion. And with electric guitars, sometimes that's what you want, right? But in general, what we're looking for and just like in photography, sometimes you want distortion too, okay? With film in particular, film grain was a really nice thing to have sometimes for particular shots. I can think of quite a few that were improved by being grainy. a lot of the times you were trying not to get grain in your photographs. Same thing with ISO. Okay, yeah, the higher you turn the volume, the more your speaker starts to distort. Well, that's what happens. It's kind of analogous to what's happening in your camera. You turn up the gain on your image sensor, you start getting noise in the image. ISO can also help you control motion blur by allowing you to increase your shutter speed, right? The more sensitive your sensor is, the faster you can make your shutter speed to let in less light. And a good example of that would be if you have a photograph where the foreground has some grass in it and the wind's blowing, like on a day like today, and the grass is blowing around, but the background's a mountain or a rock or something, and the mountain or the rock, you can shoot most of your scene at ISO, base ISO 125 for the Fuji cameras as an example, and then up your ISO so that you can freeze the motion in the grass. And then blend the two images together. I've done that successfully on some images as well. As in my first example, of course, the thing we're trying to do here is control camera shake, right? With a photograph of the rainbow in Columbia River Gorge, I was hand holding the camera. I upped my ISO to control the camera shake. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about ISO invariant cameras. And my cameras, the Fuji 40 megapixel sensor cameras, are ISO invariant, and that's a whole nother topic that would require a long video to cover. But just suffice it to say that at ISO like 1200, okay, and ISO 125, you can kind of shoot the same thing. I'll show you an example of this. And if you take the photograph into DxO Photo Labs, for example, if you underexpose the photograph by 4 stops and then bring it up 4 stops, it'll have the same amount of noise in it as if you shot it at the base ISO. Just know that the only thing to know there is if your camera is ISO invariant, because it means you can get away with stuff. You can expose for the highlights, let the shadows go dark, bring them up 4 stops, and you know you're not going to get any more noise than you would normally at your base ISO. It's just another trick. It would take a lot to explain it, but just be aware that it's a thing. So this was a quick look at ISO and some thoughts and things to keep in mind when you're photographing. I will say this, the mistake would be to just put your camera on auto ISO and go out and photograph everything at ISO 6400. That would be a mistake, okay? Unless you really choose that, and you want the look of all your photographs being at ISO 6400 as a creative thing, that's great. But in general, you kind of want to shoot at ISO 125 or your base ISO for your camera, and you're going to want to be on a tripod, and you're going to want to use slower shutter speeds, etc. Particularly in my genre of landscape photography, it's kind of the norm. It's kind of the way to optimize your image quality for that genre, okay? So those are really two sides of the same coin, right? So you don't want to shoot everything at ISO 6400 just because you don't know any better. And the other side of the coin is because you know better, you don't want to shoot everything at ISO 125 and lock yourself to a tripod either. And that's the point of this video. Don't be afraid to keep in mind that that ISO is a tool to be used. Just use it wisely and know what it's going to do and how it's going to affect your photograph. And that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, hey, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and we'll see you out here. Have a great one. Bye.